Hi, my name is Chad Harris. I'm really honored to be presenting today for the EA Zoom meetings. I'd like to thank Linda and all of her help for all of the work that they do. It's just such a generous offering and opportunity and sharing of the community. And it's a really great benefit for the astrological community at large. So thank you. And my background is in the archetypal astrological tradition that was developed really out of the depth psychological work from Stanislaw Grof and Richard Tarnas. And we basically understand or orient our understanding around the planets as being the archetypal forces of our psyche, the psychological forces. And the signs that they're in are more of the stylizing or coloring influences of those forces. And say the houses would be like the area of your life that those forces manifest in. So that's the basic structure. And then there's also an evolution of consciousness dimension to our perspective in that we're looking at our understanding of astrology relative to our current time period as it relates to the history of the evolution of astrology. And we see ourselves we see the astrological perspective as kind of emerging in a new capacity after the discovery of the three outer planets. And so a lot of emphasis on the outer planets. And that's probably a good background. And I personally have done a lot of work, a lot of research into the news because specifically the news of today is so kind of bewildering that it's hard to kind of grasp and make sense of what's happening. And honestly, the astrological perspective is the most and has the most capacity I'm aware of for gaining insight into cultural phenomena. And honestly, I think I would be kind of bewildered if I didn't have it to understand the nature of reality. So what I like to do today is share, it is going to be a heavy episode in that sense. There's a lot of heavy energy going on today, but I'd like to start with the Parker Solar Probe, which if you haven't heard of it, I guess I'll go ahead and start. It's a brand new probe solar satellite that we just launched to go to the sun and study the sun. It's going to, for 7 years, it's going to loop around the sun and Venus and get tighter and tighter until its orbit is really tight. And it's going to orbit within like 4 million miles of the sun. And so what's really interesting about this is that the history of flight has a strong correlation to the Jupiter-Uranus cycle. Even the first balloon flight, I think in 1883, was Jupiter-Uranus. And then the first glider flights by the Wright brothers happened at the turn of the century and 1900 during the Uranus-Pluto opposition from 1895 through 1907. And it happened to occur during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction at the early stages of the Uranus-Pluto opposition. And interestingly, the first flight over the Atlantic Ocean by Charles Lindbergh took place with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And then the first space flights that happened during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 1960s took place when Jupiter was just moving into the opposition with Uranus. What's interesting about the archetypal astrological perspective that we use wider orbs than most people use. And it comes out of Richard's research, what he recognized in his study of cultural history. He's a Harvard graduate historian, and so he was able to apply his understanding of history to what he was learning about astrology. And so when he saw these larger orbs making sense to the cultural phenomenon, that's what he expanded his understanding. So it came out of an evidentiary exposure. And so this was the first space flights. Then the Apollo moon landing took place during the next Jupiter-Uranus conjunction after the opposition of the early 60s. So the beginning of the space race in the early 60s with Jupiter-Uranus, and then kind of the Titanic fulfillment during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction and conjunct Pluto. So what's interesting to me about this with the Parker Solar Probe is that in 2010, it was refined. It's been a mission that was hypothesized in the 90s, but they refined it in 2010 in March, I believe, or early in the spring, during the beginning of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that corresponds to the Arab Spring. So just in the last conjunction, they redesigned it, and then they launched it during the opposition just now that took place August 12th. And what's interesting about this is just if you look at the Uranus-Pluto energies from the 60s and the space race, and then the Uranus-Pluto energy of our decade from 2008 to 2020, a new race, now we're going to the sun. I mean, it's an interesting correlation that we went to the moon in the Uranus-Pluto of the 60s, and then the square of our decade, we've now launched something that can actually withstand the heat of the sun. So I wanted to just bring that in as kind of a light way to start. Does anyone have any questions, or did that come across, or if not, I'll just...
So then the opposition, where will that take us? We've got the sun, and then what do you think?
When you mean when the conjunction happens again?
Yes.
In 2024? Who knows? Actually, the little bit that I studied, I believe the mission goes till about then. So that'll be really interesting to see all of the research that, everything we learn about the nature of the sun over the next 7 years. I actually forgot, I left out, there's the Cassini mission that orbited Saturn and studied 15 years, 16 years, was also launched during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1997. So there's lots of milestones and history of flight during these Jupiter-Uranus alignments. And so I was just sharing this example because I think it's probably going to be an amazing learning event. I think we're going to, be unbelievably surprised by what we learn. Interestingly, it's named after Eugene Parker, who was born in 1927 during the same Jupiter-Uranus conjunction when Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic Ocean. So he's carrying that energy in his natal chart. Genius scientist, discovered the nature of the solar wind. That's why they named it after him. And so, yeah, I just wanted to maybe start with a little bit of a light energy. So this is the chart for Jodi Kantor. So now I'm going to switch. This is, we're going to move into the Me Too movement. And I actually started this project, the Archetypes in the News project, in January or so, in large measure because of Donald Trump, and then also because of the Me Too movement. And what I saw in the amount of people who had been exposed for their sexual predatory nature or predatory acts, the amount of Mars-Pluto alignments, or Sun-Pluto or Sun-Mars, in the people who have committed the crimes ultimately. So this is, but it's interesting. I looked at the journalists. This is Jodi Kantor. She's one of the first journalists who exposed the first article. She wrote it with Megan Toohey, and they both have Mars-Pluto. She has a Mars-Pluto semi-square. It's almost exact, within half a degree, Pluto semi-square. And then Jodi Kantor has Mars in a quincunx, exact quincunx to Pluto, 150 degrees. And yeah. And then the other major journalist is Ronan Farrow. He is Mia Farrow's son, I believe. And he's born with the Mars-Pluto conjunction. So I thought it was really interesting that the journalists who are exposing this episode also carry the Mars-Pluto signature. It's kind of an interesting correlation. And so Harvey Weinstein obviously is the first person that brought out this event for us. And he's born with the Mars square Pluto. And I'm just going to go through a series of these people, and we're going to look at how many of them had the Mars-Pluto signature. This is when the Weinstein story broke. in October of 2017, and Saturn was just beginning to square his natal sun. It's about 7 degrees. And then what happens is it moves on to his moon. And this is when he got arrested in May of 2018. I only have a noon chart, so the moon could be 7 degrees on either side. But either way, the Saturn went from a 7 degree square to his sun to a 7 degree up, on the other side. And now it's back to almost exact. So interesting that Saturn, relating to karma, but then also consequences of one's actions and the authoritative structure of the government, the judicial system. So he's being brought to task by the public for his actions. And this is Rose McGowan's chart. She is one of the leaders of the Me Too movement, and she supposedly was raped by Harvey Weinstein at the Sundance Film Festival in 1997. And that was a week-long event. Well, I'll just say this first. She's born with Jupiter square to Mars, and she's born with Saturn square Pluto. And you see that a lot with people who have a difficult life. She actually was a teenage runaway. She ran away from home at 15, and she went out on her own. You can see a lot of that in the Mars square Jupiter energy. It's like that conquistador kind of take action, even in like the taking action for oppressed women or people who have been sexually violated. It's a real noble expression of the Mars Jupiter energy. And if we look at the week for when the Sundance Film Festival happened in 1997, I'm just splitting it. I went to the middle of the festival. I don't know the exact day that it took place, but in any point in that week, Mars would have been conjoining her natal Pluto, and Saturn would have been opposing her natal Pluto. So I felt like that was and squaring her natal Saturn. So you can really recognize here the possibility, the potential for a predatory act that has severe consequences. The predatory comes from Mars and Pluto. The consequences come from Saturn, the enduring, long-lasting effects that something like a violent sexual act towards one would engender. And so I just found that extremely striking, and it completely makes a lot of sense. So this is Bill Cosby's chart. He was not a part of the Me Too movement, we know, but it was just prior to it. But he's born with a Sun-Pluto conjunction, Sun-Mercury-Pluto conjunction, and it's in a trine to Mars. And when he was convicted, it was a Mars-Pluto conjunction in the sky opposite his natal sun. And it's conjoining his natal Jupiter. He has a natally, it's Pluto-Jupiter opposition with the sun. And you see that with people who have a lot of power, often a lot of wealth. I guess I should have said, in the very beginning, so much of this has to do with, it's predatory sexuality, Pluto, Mars, but it's also the power dimension of what's taking place. These people took advantage of their power in relationship to women. It's a power dynamic as almost as much as it is a sexual dynamic, it seems, because it's the use of the power that's allowing them to take advantage of other people. So when Bill Cosby was convicted, the Mars Pluto in the sky, but it's on his natal his natal Jupiter. And you see that with like the fall from grace, like the high, the high peak is the Jupiter Pluto, like in the sense of wealth and power, but then it's also the fall from grace. It's the deep descent into the underworld in a sense. So I thought that was really interesting. Oh, it's also really interesting in Bill Cosby's chart that he has the moon Neptune. Sorry, it's jumping around on me. The moon Neptune conjunction, because he was using sedatives or drugs to sedate women before he would rape them. So again, perfect. This is an supposedly accurate birth time as well. So This is Jerry Sandusky's chart. Again, not a part of the Me Too movement. He was the assistant coach for Penn State University, the football team. And I forget, he was arrested several years ago, but sexually molesting many, many young boys. And he's born with Sun opposite Pluto and Mars, Uranus, but in a sextile to Pluto. So the potential for the predatory power dynamic and the sexual predation, again, seems to really fit these alignments. So we have our predator in chief. Donald Trump has Mars rising, but Pluto is at the exact midpoint of Saturn and Mars. And you can really feel this in him. He never backs down. It's always this Saturnian, wall and fortified boundary that he puts up, and then he's always attacking outside of himself. And this is his, you see the midpoint alignment, Pluto at the Mars-Pluto midpoint. It's exact within 15 minutes. So this is Roy Moore. He was he was an Alabama governor. I'm not sure. He was in Alabama. He was running for Senate, and he has the Mars-Pluto opposition. And he was not convicted, but accused by several young women of molestation. And Donald Trump was supporting him for running for Senate in spite of those accusations that seem to be valid. Kevin Spacey, I'm sure you all know from House of Cards and the other major movies he's been in. He has a Mars-Pluto conjunction with Venus. And Charlie Rose, I imagine most of you know potentially from even international news. He was born with Mars square Pluto. It's like a 7-degree, 8-degree square. And Jeffrey Tambor is he was the actor on the transgender show. I didn't watch it, but he's born with a really interesting alignment. It's a midpoint alignment between Mars, Pluto, and the Sun and Venus. So it's like Pluto at Venus, Jupiter, and Mars, Sun midpoint. And he played a transsexual and was accused, I believe, by several of the transsexual actresses that he was working with and that he was learning from of sexual molestation. So this is John Conyers' chart. He was the senator from Michigan, or congressman from Michigan, I believe. And he also born with a really interesting midpoint alignment. It's a wide Mars-Pluto conjunction, 15 degrees, but Venus is it's squared widely to Pluto and it's squared to Mars as well. And it's exact to the midpoint, about 2 degrees to the midpoint, I believe. So yeah, here's Conyers midpoint, Venus, Mars, Pluto, 210. So it combines all of the energies together. This is Mark Halpern's chart. He was the lead political analysis for ABC News. Also, Mars-Pluto conjunction, lost his job with the Me Too movement. Matt Lauer is the previous host of the NBC Today show, Mars square Pluto. I don't know exactly what all he was accused of. I think it was just silly things on some level, like around NBC headquarters, but he was known for it all, like just leaving things around. I don't know. Really interesting. So this is Steve Wynn. He's the Las Vegas conglomerate mega casino operator. He's born with Sun square Mars and opposite Pluto. So it's a T-square between Sun, Pluto, and Mars. And so multi-billionaire and using his power in negative ways, clearly. This is Eric Greitens. He was the former governor of Missouri. He was accused he had an affair prior to becoming governor, and in order to try and maintain her silence, he tied up his partner in a weird sexual position and took pictures of her and then tried to blackmail her. And he was eventually, he resigned as governor just a couple of months ago. And this is Les Moonves. He is one of the more recent ones. He's the CEO, I believe, of CBS News or CBS Total. and he's born with the Mars-Pluto conjunction. And so this was really interesting. He's also born on the day of, or just like maybe 12 hours before a lunar eclipse. So the nodes here are at 16, and the sun would come at 14, and the eclipse probably took place at 14 degrees Aries. And so it would have been an eclipse, a lunar eclipse, trine his Mars-Pluto, and the evidence that came out against Les Moonves happened in the last month during the major lunar eclipse in Europe that was conjunct Mars. So I thought that was interesting correlation as well. And this is Asia Argento's chart. She was also one of the leaders of the Me Too movement, and just recently it's come out that she potentially molested a young actor who she was a director of, I believe, in a series. And she's accused of, she definitely has paid money to him, but the accusations are denied. But she's also one of the accusers of Harvey Weinstein. So what's interesting about her chart is she's born with Sun conjunct Pluto. It's a 12-degree conjunction, but she's born with Sun square Mars, and potentially Mars square the moon as well. Again, a noon chart, the moon could be 7 degrees on either side. If she's born much later than noon, it would move out of orb for the square to the moon, or square to Mars. But earlier in the day, it would be even tighter, which would fit if she's guilty of the potential molestation of a young child. But it's really interesting with, murder victims or murderers. From understanding what Rob Hand has said several times is that astrologers can't tell the difference between a murderer's chart and the murderee, the victim. So it's an interesting situation where we're on both sides of the archetypal complexes. We both embody them, but we're also experiencing them in our lives. So they can come through in both ways. She claims, I believe, I don't know if she was raped, but molested by Harvey Weinstein when she was 21. So we also know from psychology that children who are abused tend to become abusers. Often, not tend to, but often is the case that they repeat the same traumas that they have experienced. So, not trying to place judgment, just trying to show what I recognized here. And okay, this is a different situation. That was where I want to complete the Me Too piece. And I think I want to ask, does anyone have any questions at this point? Because I kind of ran through that. There's actually a lot more we could say about it.
I had a statement that I wanted to make. Tarana Burke is the originator of the Me Too movement, who does not hardly ever get mentioned.
What's her name again?
Tarana Burke. She started the Me Too movement back in 2006. And she has a very tight Saturn-Pluto square. I have not seen a birth time for her. Possibly has the moon in either Pisces or Aries. But I think with kind of her activism work in this arena here, I'm kind of leaning towards that moon in Aries. She was born September 12, 1973.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. Tarana Burke?
Yes. Tarana. I think I'm spelling it right.
What was the date?
September 12th, 1973.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'll definitely look into that. Thanks, Wanda. So yeah, there's a lot to cover there, but so this is Stephen Paddock's chart. He is the person who committed the largest act of sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. So in Las Vegas, he used a gun to kill the most people in United States history in a single mass shooting event. So, and what happened is in the investigation, they are completely stumped. They believe they've closed the investigation now, and they do not have any motive. This person was a gambler at the Mandalay Bay, Las Vegas casino, and he was a high stakes gambler. He's a multi-millionaire, and he did so well there. When you're a gambler and you're at a casino and you go there all the time, they give you rights that that other people don't often have. And so he was such a member that he was able to go to this hotel, rent a suite in the corner room, and then go use the service elevators, the waiters' elevators, to bring his weapons. He had caches of weapons, way more weapons than he actually used. So he brought all these weapons up to this room, and then committed the largest mass murder event in the United States history. And he did such a good job of covering his trails. They could not find a motive, like any motive at all. He had a repressed life. He had a wife that was Filipino, and she didn't know anything about it. He basically kind of kept her in the dark, it seemed like, about most of his life. And so what's fascinating about this is that they studied him, they researched deeply into his life, and they came up with nothing. They were completely at a loss as to any reason why he would have had the motive to do this. Now, I'm not saying that I can understand why he did this in any way, but I do believe we have access to the interiority on some level of his being, and we have access to, on a certain level, what he was, not what he's thinking, but what energies were happening for him at that time. So he's born with the Mars-Jupiter conjunction, but Mars squared to Pluto, Pluto opposite the moon, and he's born with the sun opposite Saturn and Neptune. And, Saturn and Neptune can come through in a lot of really amazing ways. Gandhi had it, Martin Luther King had the trine, the Dalai Lama has the conjunction. Many monks and mystics and people who have like a devoted Saturn spiritual practice, where they're committed Saturn to bringing in the spiritual vision and bringing it into the world. But it also corresponds to people who are deeply interested in neuropathology and people who actually suffer from neuropathology. And the reasons are, it seems, is that Neptune relates to our stream and flow of consciousness. Like it's the way we imagine the world, the way we perceive on some level. Mercury has a lot to do with that, pattern recognition and stuff. But the stream and flow of our awareness, like the ocean of consciousness that we're swimming in, is a Neptunian phenomenon. And Neptune also relates to our imagination, what we think is real. And Saturn relates to what everyone agrees is real. And when the two are together, it can be everything from, like I mentioned with Gandhi and the Dalai Lama, but like it can also be the opposite of that. A lot of atheists have Saturn Neptune. Some of the great skeptics have Saturn Neptune. David Hume and Freud come to mind, but it's like the skepticism comes from Saturn, and it's skepticism of any transcendent reality, of any deeper meaning, of any higher dimension of reality. And so you can get a lot of like pessimism and depression and mental anxiety and a sense of closed off mental awareness. Pessimistic, closed off, downward looking, not, whereas like if a Jupiter Neptune, it's more optimistic. It tends to be kind of a go with the flow energy, where Saturn Neptune is a little bit more challenging in that sense. It can be. Saturn Neptune, just the opposite of that, can come off as like the cool too, where like the stream and flow of consciousness has this like Saturn stability to it. So Saturn Neptune, they're probably the most disparate two archetypal complexes that we have. One being what is transcendent to the material form, and one being what's the form. And so they're just really, you know, as much as polar opposites can be in a certain level, Saturn, Neptune represent as in our experience. And so back to the mental potential for mental disturbance or pessimism or pathology, it seems as though this was the case with Mr. Paddock, that he had Sun opposite Neptune and Saturn, and he was struggling with mental illness, and he probably wasn't talking about it with anyone. And what's really fascinating about his transits for the event is that Uranus in the sky was opposing his natal Saturn and Neptune. And when Uranus opposes Saturn, often, I mean, when, let's say, when someone is already moving towards a potential crisis, Uranus brings in the sudden, unexpected, and with Saturn, it can be the loss or the cutting off or the breakdown, the psychological breakdown where it's, I've had enough, I'm out. And fascinating, there was a Mars-Pluto trine in the sky, 1 degree from exact, just 2 degrees to trining his natal Mars. So a grand trine from Mars to Mars and Pluto to Mars. And Pluto is also squaring his sun. So he has a grand trine between Mars and Pluto and his natal Mars. And he happens to pull off the most successful mass murder event in United States history. So again, it's not showing us what he was thinking. I forgot Saturn in the sky, exactly square his natal Mercury, 22 Sag to 22 Pisces. So again, more mental constriction on one's mental processes, feeling as though reality is closing in on one in a sense, potentially. So really fascinating signatures there that seem to actually color and help us understand a little bit of what was happening with him, that honestly, I don't think that even the authorities looking at the case could come to anything like this. Not that it actually gives us answers, but no one seems to have any answers. So I think it's extremely striking. It's another one of my things I'm really interested in is mass murderers, like serial killers. Like, why does that happen? And you see a lot of Mars Pluto in those charts as well. So now I have, do you have a question? Someone have a question? Lee? You have to unmute your,
Okay.
There you go.
Could you go back to that chart for a moment?
Please, yes.
Yeah. Here was my thought is that in terms of seeing the motives, I would think that it would be good to go back into his, key points in his childhood and early development. There's something about, to me, there's something about key moments, key either conflicts or some kind of alienation forms that happened a lot earlier than these events. That's my intuition about it. So that when I'm looking at when he was born and, maybe if you have these other pieces of information, I think it's kind of locked into the, probably the family constellation, but maybe even some other key events. You might see some kind of intimations of where he got into a serious psychological separation. That's my take on it. In terms of trying to discover or trying to see what might motivate someone. Mm-hmm. I don't know that he had animus towards those people in particular, unless they represented something to him that was significant in his past.
Yeah. It is really interesting that he has the Moon Pluto opposition in his natal chart, and it's a noon chart, but it's just 2 degrees, so it would be opposite at any point in the day. so he definitely has a Moon-Pluto opposition, and that would certainly fit what you're saying, that there's a deep trauma in the childhood experience in the lunar moon aspect of oneself, and the trauma potentially, or whatever violation potentially happened to him came from the Plutonic in that sense. I didn't actually do the research on his upbringing, his family life. That would be the next step to actually look at, to see what, I know he's born in Iowa. I don't remember much about that part. That's a great point though, Lee.
But that's a kind of an interesting approach to using this kind of astrology to, actually try to understand some of the elements of what mass murderers or something.
Yeah, it's extremely fascinating. Last year when the other shootings it was like a spree that was really happening in Dallas and in Baton Rouge. All of those, many of them had Mars-Pluto alignments. Really, really interesting. So I'm gonna move on. And
excuse me, before you move on,
yes.
How come the moon's nodes aren't showing in these charts?
There's just times like when I've in the past, I haven't used them as much, and I know that you guys use them more. So when I've been doing new charts, I'm putting them in, but some of these are older charts that I'm just extracting from my files.
Yeah, I was looking for planets squaring the nodes, but anyway, not to worry.
Okay, I'm in every new chart that I'm doing, I'm putting them in. So
okay, wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
So this is I'm gonna start maybe like how far are we in? I have no time sense.
We're in about
45 minutes.
Minutes. Yes.
Okay. Let's see then. Yeah, well, so I have, there's actually 3 clips. This is the longest one. It's about 5 minutes long. And then there's a clip from Noam Chomsky. And then there's a clip from Trump himself. And it's a bit of a narrative that I'm trying to unfold here. And we're just going to move into Trump and what's happening right now. And basically the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that's coloring so much of what we're seeing in the world right now. And I think this will actually really help. I think it's really help us potentially engender a really interesting discussion. So one thing I should say is that when we did the test for the audio on this, it's not going to come through really clear because it's picking up the sound directly from my computer to the microphone. There's a little bit of like animated sound noise in the video that's not going to come through clear, but when they're talking, hopefully it will be. And yeah, I hope this goes well.
Nationality feels so powerful. We fight for our country, we cheer for it, we draw our values from it. It's a big way many of us describe who we are, but it didn't used to be. Up until really recently, our identities came from stuff immediately around us. Clans, religion, family. If you think about it, nationality is weird. The idea that you identify with millions of strangers just based on borders. That's because national identity is made up. National identity is the myth that built the modern world, but it also primes us for dictatorship, racism, genocide. But today, we're fighting over whether to keep that kind of national identity. To understand why, you have to see how new this idea is. So you think you know what France is. It's a place united by the French, right? But as of the French Revolution, half of the people there could not speak French. Only 1 in 8 spoke it well. These are the languages that people spoke. Just a patchwork that didn't line up with borders. We know from modern genetics that ethnicity didn't line up with borders either. National identity became the idea that language, race, and borders should add up to a country. Nations can't admit they're made up, so they invent a national mythology that says they've been like this forever. The modern era brought 4 big changes that led to national identity. People moved in big numbers from the country to the city, and they needed a common language. New technology like newspapers and trains made countries feel smaller and more interconnected. War was changing into this vast, all-consuming thing. Countries needed people to care so much about their nation, they'd fight for it in huge numbers. Governments were challenging religion for power. Here's Napoleon taking his crown from the Pope to crown himself emperor. It was a big deal. These 4 things sparked an era of revolutions and democracy, but they also unleashed ideas of nationalism, militarism, and leader worship. People came to see their countries as extensions of...
Oh no. Did it stop?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Hold on.
of themselves. This new identity meant that a nation got its authority not from the government or the king or God, but from the people. This changed the world, but it also changed how we think. National identity changes our reality. We experience whatever happens to our nation as if it happened to us. Rocky IV can tell us a lot about what national identity does to our brains. A 1994 study tested the attitudes of Americans watching the movie. It includes an amazing footnote. All 216 participants were women because, quote, there were no males who had not seen Rocky IV. Anyway, when Rocky beat his Russian opponent, participants who strongly identified as American felt a boost in self-esteem. When they were shown re-edited footage to make it look like Rocky lost, they felt a drop in self-esteem, and they became likelier to hold negative views about Russians. But when they said something bad about Russians, their self-esteem recovered. And when we feel threatened, it makes us want to humiliate and dominate the outsider. That dynamic doesn't just apply to individuals. It can apply to whole societies. And this can drive war itself. One study found that any country whose team plays in the World Cup becomes likelier to launch attacks abroad. That hostility also plays out against minorities and migrants who don't fit the national myth. It only took a century for these problems of modern nationalism to culminate into World War II, something so terrible it convinced the world to try a new kind of national identity. This model of identity is based on an idea from the United States. Anyone can be American if you share values like freedom and hard work.
May I please remind you that it does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty.
It's a stirring idea, but it never completely worked.
Your race is your nation.
If you don't speak English and don't contribute, get out.
The belief that being American is really about race, religion, and language also runs throughout history. So what makes a country? Which identity should matter? That fight defines so much of the world right now, and it's intensifying. You see it in the backlash to the European Union.
We've got our country back.
You see it in how Donald Trump began his campaign.
We either have a country or we don't, and it's that simple.
The national myth is powerful. We fight for a common past and a common future. It isn't real, but that doesn't matter. We've been taught for so long that this is who we are. Building a world based on shared values really means creating a new myth. But that only works if it feels as powerful as the last one.
So basically, what I want to say about that is, yeah, national identity is an illusion, and it's something that, you know, the astrological perspective, it transcends. It doesn't recognize borders. And I see it as a new myth, you know, but a genuine myth, a real myth, not an artificially constructed myth, that can reunite all of humanity ultimately. And after having this, you know, evolution of differentiation into different beings, but we're ultimately not separate. And this is what the astrological perspective demonstrates that it doesn't favor these false divisions that we have placed. And what's fascinating about like what they just mentioned with how we identify with these things that we have inside of our borders, and if we're fearful, we feel as though we need to destroy the other, and this is so much of what we're seeing happening in the world with the, like they said, Brexit and the nationalist movements around the world, and Trump. But they're false boundaries. They're not real, and ultimately we need to transcend the whole situation. So this is Noam Chomsky. He is a genius, MIT linguist. He's a radical social, socially minded. I mean, I don't think he's a socialist necessarily, maybe, but he's. I find him to be one of the smartest people alive today, honestly. And what he's going to describe is a mythology that is at the roots of the United States that I wasn't aware of until recently, until listening to him talk about it, actually, because it's the same mythology ultimately that Hitler used to carry out his wishes. So here's Chomsky. It's only about 2 minutes long.
The basic story, what goes back to Tacitus, that there was an Aryan race which suddenly appeared, somewhere around where Iran is, and they were just a different species, tall, blonde. You go back a century, the biologists were showing that their heads were rounder, which is better to be a round head, and they were unique, blue-eyed, blonde, conquered everything, great commitment, law, and freedom, and so on. And they emerged there, and then they started moving. They moved west. Everything's got to be west. So they moved to Germany, to the Black Forests, and there they became the Teutons, who were a perfect race. The real good ones just exterminated everyone. So they kept the purity of the race. And the good ones became the Angles and the Saxons, who went to the English Channel and then crossed it and exterminated everyone, and they maintained racial purity. They didn't get rid of all the Celts. Some of them hung around in Ireland and places like that, but they did a pretty good job of it. And then after that, they went to, the colonists came to America, going west. That's you're the Anglo-Saxons, and you get it in Thomas Jefferson. It's universal in the 19th century. We're the Anglo-Saxons. Jefferson and others thought we ought to go back to the 8th century before the race was poisoned by immigration to England from elsewhere than the Norman conquest, when they had the perfect system of laws and the most just so-and-so. And then by the time you get to, and of course the Native Americans, well, obviously an inferior race. So therefore it was right to exterminate them. And as Roosevelt pointed out in the quotes that I mentioned, they were the beneficiaries of our exterminating them, just like the Filipinos and so on, because that was a sacrifice to create a superior race and so on. I mean, racism in the United States is not just anti-Black racism. It's far deeper. And that's why every wave of immigrants has been treated with real racial abuse. I mean, take, say, Boston, a century ago now, a century and a half ago in Boston, the Irish were considered like dogs. You'd have restaurants with signs saying no dogs are Irish. And the average lifespan of an Irish male was, I think, under 20 years old. And so Huns were treated the same way, everyone from Southeastern Europe, the Jews. The worst were the Chinese. The first total racial exclusion act was against the Chinese. They were afraid of them.
So, I was pretty stunned by learning this, and it makes a lot of sense for the way that we have, I think in large manner unconsciously treated other people I'm a complete beneficiary of this ideology, and it's shocking. It's disturbing. I feel as though what's really interesting about what I'll get to in just a minute, we're going to talk about the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions that correspond to like the Immigration Act against the Chinese that he just mentioned, and the series of Saturn-Pluto alignments that correspond to the world wars, that type of thing, and how we tend to put up more boundaries and project more evil during these periods. But what I want to do right now is demonstrate Donald Trump's specific, or it's a really good example. This is only about 30 seconds long, I believe so.
My father Germany, my mother Scotland. So I have great love for countries in Europe. I think what's happened to Europe is a shame. I think the immigration, allowing the immigration to take place in Europe is a shame. I think it changed the fabric of Europe. And unless you act very quickly, it's never going to be what it was. And I don't mean that in a positive way. So I think allowing millions and millions of people to come in to Europe is very, very sad. I think you're losing your culture.
So, I don't know if Donald Trump is consciously doing this or if it's just an unconscious process. But it's clearly racist at its core, these thoughts. And I started my this project and everything because Donald Trump really he's disturbing. I find him repulsive, and what I've come to that repulsion, it's what I recognize is that in the same way that he projects his shadow onto others, my repulsion against him is part of my own shadow. It's the things in me that are similar to him that I don't like about myself that I don't like about him. So I'm trying to move my orientation, my understanding from one really of like repulsion and anger to one of compassion, because it's ultimately really sad what's happening. It seems as though he's losing his his pathological lying is spiraling downward in a way that he's probably going to have a psychological meltdown in front of everybody, and it's not something to be happy about. It's really a sad situation. I found myself in the beginning being like, Trump, and all this righteousness you feel about when he says something stupid or whatever, but like, it's just sad. I mean, this is a really, really sad situation. And what I think is really important about all of it for us is to recognize like how much of a shadow embodiment of his chart he is, and that like the astrological perspective can actually help us recognize those dimensions of ourselves and to move into a new relationship with them so as not to be possessed by their darker potentials, to move into a more life-enhancing expression of the same archetypal principles. Because Donald Trump's birth chart's amazing. It could be done really lovingly and brilliant, but it's not. It seems. So I'm trying to move my orientation, my understanding. I think it's a big lesson that I'm learning personally. So the Immigration Act does anyone want to say anything about the videos I just showed, or if not, I don't know if we want to take the break or not, but I have basically a series of Saturn-Pluto alignments, and then things on Trump and what's happening with his transits and the multiple allegations that have just come up, and with Nixon and that type of thing. But
okay, let's have a break now.
Is this?
And then we can come back to all of that. after 15 minutes. How's that?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, fantastic. It's wonderful what you're presenting. I'm glued to the screen. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll be back in 15 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so to begin the second half, to follow up on a little bit of what Noam Chomsky was saying about the first Immigration Act was against Chinese people, and it happened in 1882, and there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And it's interesting that we'll see this theme play out over and over again, where when the Saturn-Pluto complex comes into active operative orb, we tend to see more propensity for highly defined boundaries and the tendency to identify the good, what's on the inside of our boundaries, and the tendency to see what we repress or what we don't like, shadow, Pluto, onto the other. And it was interesting, to hear Donald Trump's rhetoric in Europe. That was just a month ago or so, that interview, and how similar he was describing the loss of culture because of immigration, because you're losing your identity and you're losing your what you thought was your boundaries that would make you different from someone else. And ultimately, we're not ultimately different. We're all human beings. There are no races. That's a human construct. There's the human species. And this is what the astrological perspective shows us, is that we're all connected. And so this is the Immigration Act of 1882, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And World War I, Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And the Great Depression, Saturn-Pluto opposition. And World War II, Saturn square Pluto. And the beginning of the Cold War is also when Israel and Pakistan were founded, Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And all of Israel's wars, actually, the Suez Canal War in 1956, 55, 56, this is also another crisis in the Cold War. And Vietnam, this is, we were in Vietnam in 1961, I believe, but the escalation happened in 65, 66, when we put over 500,000 soldiers there. And the 6-Day War, and the Israel-Arab 6-Day War took place then as well. And 1974 is the Watergate crisis and the Yom Kippur War, which also led to an energy crisis here in the United States because of, I think OPEC restrained their oil production. And the 1982 Saturn-Pluto conjunction, this is interesting. It was kind of the end of the Cold War. I mean, this is right, Gorbachev comes to power in 83, and then Reagan and Gorbachev kind of, end the Cold War. But this is when people were most fearful of its potential consequences, because Reagan was a hardliner, he came to power, and people were fearful, especially astrologers, actually, who had recognized the Saturn-Pluto conjunction or Saturn-Pluto cycle with World War I and World War II. There was a lot of fear in astrologers, from my understanding, that this could have led to World War III in their minds. It didn't, obviously. But what's interesting about it is this is, in 1983, was the Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon, which is the first fundamentalist Islam extremist attack against the West, suicide attack. I mean, there had been attacks before, but the first suicide attack was, I guess, Hezbollah at the direction of Syria, I believe, who put in a truck bomb in the Marine barracks and killed 200 and some Marines, and Reagan pulled out of Lebanon. And what's interesting is the next Saturn-Pluto square was the first World Trade Center attack in 1993. Muslim extremists drove a truck into the base of the World Trade Center, truck bomb, and tried to blow up the Twin Towers that way, but it didn't work. And I don't know how many people were killed. But this is also when the Rwandan genocide took place. Clearly, an othering, Saturn-Pluto othering of divisions of people who actually aren't very different at all. And 9/11, this is the next Saturn-Pluto opposition after the square of 92, 94. And obviously horrific attacks. And George Bush comes out and he says, you're either with us or you're against us. And, just kind of defining what I'm talking about. Like, you're either with us on the good side of reality or you're on the evil side and you're out to be destroyed. So this psychological splitting and othering tends to be magnified by Saturn-Pluto periods. It's in us all the time, but it seems to come to a more intense focus and expression during the Saturn-Pluto alignments. And our last square we just had from 2008 through 2012 really was corresponds to the major economic Great Recession we just went through, and the Syrian Civil War, which is the most devastating war in my lifetime, and is it's who knows what it's leading to in the Middle East. And now we're in a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Started 2017 really and goes through 2021. And we were just witnessing, and what we can all see in the world is there's a real nationalistic movement. There's a real pullback from the globalist movement that developed out of World War II. And, it makes sense in the sense that, World War I was a conjunction of Saturn-Pluto. At the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War was a conjunction. At the end of the Cold War, really, conjunction. And then now we're at the next conjunction. So after, on some level, the beginning of our war against fundamentalist Islam kind of began in the 80 to 84 conjunction. Who knows what's going to develop now? It doesn't really seem like that's the wave that's developing. There was an ISIS attack like yesterday because Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, he has just come out of hiding in a sense for the first time in years. And he called for attacks against the West. And there was a knife attack 2 days ago in France, but killed 2 people or something, or I'm not sure. It was just a really small attack. So, who knows what the future holds, but it doesn't seem as though that's the wave that's moving right now. It's much more about the trade war that Trump has kind of incited, and then the nationalist pullback that he's really, really instigating. I mean, well, it's been happening, but he is definitely a nationalist and making it a lot easier for other countries to fall into that same movement of recalcitrance and just fortifying one's boundaries and taking care of oneself. So I feel like this is all important because, I believe, national identities and nations are a construct. And, at a certain point in the future, we won't have them and we won't recognize them to have the values that we apply to them now. So, yeah, I just think that this can help us move in that direction, hopefully. So I'm gonna unpack Trump's chart a little bit here. We'll do a pretty good analysis of this, hopefully. And please, if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about. Oh yeah, this is an old chart. Sorry, Linda. The nodes are right here, 22, 21, I believe, maybe 21. It's right on his moon node. So he's born actually I think an hour with an hour or so before a lunar eclipse actually, and which actually makes sense if you think about the moon as the relational field and the relational dynamic of one's being, and it's eclipsed. It's in the shadow. He doesn't seem to have a healthy relationship with what we call other. And yeah, it seems to be a real a real wound there. He doesn't, from what I can gather, he doesn't talk about his mother. He talks about his father a lot. So I'm not sure of that dynamic, but there seems to be some wound there. And then, his chart is amazing in a lot of ways. He's born with the Sun-Uranus conjunction, and you see that in, a certain level of genius. I mean, there's definitely some level of genius happening there. At the same time, there's a lot of delusion, but there's a certain genius, and he definitely has good fortune. And you can really see that with Jupiter in the trine to the Sun. Born on third base, in a sense, and thinking he had a triple, I guess. But the thing is it's the shadow side of Sun Jupiter is arrogance and inflation and a superiority complex. And this seems to be the way that he is embodying it a bit more than the generosity of spirit that can also come from a Jupiter Sun alignment. So unfortunately, it seems to be working in more of the shadow dimension. And then I mentioned before the Mars rising and Pluto at the midpoint of Saturn and Mars. And it's interesting, his one of the people he idolized and modeled himself after was Roy Cohn, who was the lawyer for Joe McCarthy in the McCarthy trials. And I'm not a student of Roy Cohn. I haven't studied him that much, but my understanding is that he was a ruthless lawyer, and just never backed down. His mode was never apologize, always double down, always attack. And you can see that seems to be the method that Trump has embodied from his model, Roy Cohn. And this really fits the Mars, Saturn, Pluto aspect, because it's when one is attacked or feels fearful, Mars, Saturn, the boundaries become stronger, and then the projection and intensity becomes more fortified and more projected outwardly. So you can see that, like, there was a part in the clip, and then in the national identity clip, where they were talking about how fear can mobilize whole nations to act out. And it seems as though that's potentially at the core of what's happening. It's fearful rhetoric, like the Mexicans are rapists and murderers and that type of thing. It's a fear of the other that's driving this like intense rage that he's expressing, projecting outwardly onto anything he sees as other. And he has a Venus-Saturn conjunction, which you can recognize in his values. He judges, like everything is judged. He's the judge of all of these things. He's judging right and wrong. I mean, on Twitter, he judges the social sphere all the time. But the way he embodies, the way he is lack of respect for women. It's an objectifying. Venus is a tool. It's something to be utilized. It's something to have, to possess, to possession, rather than honoring it for a sense of other. It's more like it's his, and he's judging it, and it's a constriction or something that he's placing on it, rather than allowing it to flourish in and of itself. And then the last major aspect, which is probably one of the most important, is he has Mercury square to Neptune. And this is the part of his psychology that is challenged by reality, by the nature of the truth of reality. It's the delusional aspect of his rhetoric, his inability to stick to the truth. I think it's calculated now that he tells about 6.5 lies a day. They've calculated it's like over 7,000 some lies since he took office. we can't forget that he rose to political power on a racist lie that the first Black president was not born in the United States. And, I think everyone is a little bit blown away that we have this level, and I mean like a childlike level of psyche, of psychological awareness as the leader of the free world. And yeah, it's a really sad situation in a lot of ways. But my real take on it is that he was actually meant to be elected so that he can bring to light the shadow that's in all of us. Because we all carry shadow, and to different levels, and he's embodying it to the hypermost. And in doing so, he is revealing and showing us how not to be, ultimately, and how when we can become more aware of our psychological predispositions, that we can potentially move into a new relationship with them and express them in ways that we aren't unconscious puppets, potentially, of their shadow expressions. That seems to be one of the more important potentials of the astrological perspective, period, that we can move into a new understanding, a deeper, larger breadth of understanding of who we are and why we are the way we are, and to move into a new relationship with those psychological complexes. This seems to be, to me, what the astrological perspective is saying. It's like, here, this is who you are. This is how you tend to see the world. How do you want to work with that? And the way to do that is through your transits. I mean, one of the best ways is to work with your transits, because they're unfolding your natal chart as they are aligning with it. And so we're either moving in concert with them, or we're kind of unconscious puppets of their energies in a lot of ways. So this is Donald Trump's election transits, and I don't do prediction. I don't actually believe that reality is set. That's why I don't do predictions. I literally think it's an unknown, indeterminate world, and that it is evolving. And if you can make a prediction about it, you have a real high level of intuition, or potentially clairvoyant. It's just hard for me to go there. It's hard for me to think that the future is already set in some predetermined way. So therefore, I see it as an open-ended reality, and hard for me to pin down any prediction. But I was on a podcast on October 28th, 2015. We were asked to look at the transits of Trump and Clinton at the time. And I said he had better transits. I said he had the best transits to win. I didn't predict him to win. On the night of the election, I actually thought she would win, just the polls and whatever desire, my own hope. But on that day, what I looked at was that, because he's born with the Sun, Uranus, Jupiter trine, and that is the good fortune. That is the good luck. That is, the sudden, unexpected good fortune, actually. And on the night of the election, Uranus was opposite his natal Jupiter, just 4 degrees away, and it was sextile to his Sun, just 1 degree. He's born with the conjunction. He's got the sextile moving back there. And then Jupiter was just moving into the return. So he's moving into his Jupiter return, and it's the beginning of the Jupiter-Uranus opposition. So the Jupiter-Uranus opposition corresponds to, I said before, like the history of spaceflight. But I didn't mention it's also the history of quantum mechanics and scientific discovery and unexpected breakthroughs. And the unexpected good fortune, the unexpected, wow, oh my God, he won, totally fits the Jupiter-Uranus opposition in the sky at that time. And it was on his natal Jupiter. And, everybody was surprised. Even Trump was surprised. So that really fits to me. He also had really difficult transits, Saturn opposite Uranus, and he had Uranus was squaring his natal Saturn. So those are two, double transits, Uranus, Saturn, Saturn, Uranus, that you could see like sudden, unexpected good fortune, like the rug being pulled out from one, or for, and that actually happened a lot during the election. There were several things that, the Access Hollywood tape or the comments or whatever. There were lots of things that were just like, looked like the rug was being, he's pulling it out from himself, but that ultimately didn't happen. It seems as though the Jupiter return, Uranus sextile Sun, won the day in a sense. So I'm just highlighting what I see in, his unexpected surprise victory. And then just, I guess 5 months into his presidency, he decides to fire James Comey, the head of the FBI. And this is basically what's led to everything. It's led to the investigation. The investigation might have happened anyway, but this is what triggered it. And so people were already concerned about his relationship with Russia, and did he actually collude in a sense, or it's conspiracy. It's not collusion. He potentially conspired with the Russian government to basically defraud the American people. If you're not playing fair in the elections, you're defrauding the American people of their democratic process. And the same is true for the payments. Let's still talk about this first. Okay, so interestingly, when he fired James Comey, this is when Saturn was opposing his sun, and Mercury in the sky was square to his natal Saturn. And you often see with Mercury Saturn alignments is Mercury decisions that have more important consequences. Saturn, it's often decisions that are negative consequences, or you feel as though it was a mistake, but not always. But also often it can be decisions that have large consequences, that a large level of responsibility or duty that comes along with the decision. All those things are Saturn. But in this case, it seems to have directly led to for the Mueller investigation to take place. And so, I think that's an interesting correspondence. And then just a few months after that was the Charlottesville incidents, which, if you don't know, there was a racist rally, a Unite the Right rally, I guess. It's a white supremacist rally, KKK imagery, and they marched in Charlottesville the night before this incident, and with tiki torches and marching and saying, "Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." And there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these people, if you see the images. And they felt emboldened to come out without masks, to show their faces, because Donald Trump was elected president. He seems to have sanctioned the courage to show themselves. And from my understanding, actually, what's happened since then is a lot of those people have been fired from their jobs, and it's all broken up. Like the rallies that happened this year are just, there was nobody there, because a lot of those people were actually identified on those films, and they were there. From my understanding, a lot of the white supremacist organizations are not doing as well as they were a year ago because of what happened here. So everything's like waves, comes and goes, but this seems to be been a real wave that took place. And I didn't finish the story. So in Charlottesville, the protest happened, and then there was the next day there was an anti-protest, and then there was conflict, and one of the right racists drove his car into a crowd of people and killed a young woman who Heather Heyer, who is actually a really amazing person. She was one of the people, from my understanding, is actually would talk about race in ways that many people are uncomfortable with, but she would bring it up in helpful ways to show how we are behaving these ways. So she was actually a real activist in this way, and it's really sad that she was killed, but maybe a larger purpose in there too. So this is interesting because the Great American Eclipse, the eclipse that crossed the United States this one here, happened just 10 days after that rally took place. So, and the eclipse happened at 28 Leo, which is on his ascendant and conjoining his natal Mars. So it's what's happening is it's revealing the shadow of his Mars. And, you know, what have we seen for the last year? Just, you know, he attacks everybody. It's the shadow side of his Mars in lots of ways. And he was literally sanctioning, you know, violence in some level, with his comments surrounding, because what he said was that there were good people on both sides, meaning that there were good people on the racist right and the people who were protesting that. So his comments will linger and got him in a lot of trouble. What's interesting about the path of the eclipse itself is that, from my understanding, and Dale O'Brien, astrologer Dale O'Brien pointed this out, is that it actually starts in Lincoln City, Oregon, and it goes through Lincoln, Nebraska, and it finishes in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, which is where the Civil War began. So, like, you know, the eclipse is revealing the shadow of the United States. And it's, you know, it seems to be more than that. Like, the role of the United States as like leader of the free world since the end of World War II also seems to be kind of coming to an end. You know, we elected the first president that had no political experience, and he's dismantling a lot of what we've understood as our institutions. So you can see this like in multivalent ways, where the eclipse is really revealing a lot of the shadow of the United States, and which also fits the Pluto return is happening as well. But this seems to be a really clear example of, you know, the racist shadow in particular being made more highlighted, made more aware of it. So the most recent event that actually feels like it really has changed the dynamic is Trump's visit to Helsinki, where he actually met with Vladimir Putin. And so to contextualize this, it's in the middle of an investigation of whether or not Donald Trump conspired with Vladimir Putin to defraud the United States people. And he went to Helsinki, and everyone was telling him, all of his closest advisors and everyone in the United States, in many ways, or definitely the Democratic side, was that he shouldn't meet with him alone. But Trump insisted that he have a meeting with Putin alone. And he did that, but then he comes out on stage and speaks next to Putin and basically supports everything that Putin is saying, doesn't call him out on the fact that the Russians have been indicted for hacking into the Democratic election or Democratic computers. He basically doesn't stand up for the United States people against someone, head of government, who has attacked us. And that's why John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, said that it was nothing short of treasonous. And the reason he's saying that is because treason is defined as an attack by, or it's colluding, conspiring with an enemy in war. So like it's a specific definition. It's not just like defrauding the United States. It has to be in war and specifically with the enemy. And this actually that's why John Brennan said those words, is because we were attacked. We're not necessarily at war, but it is a low-grade cyber war. And we were attacked, and he, instead of, you know, confronting him, he sided with them. So this seems to be kind of potentially the light in the crack, in the shell that's exposing or light is exposing the shadow of who he is and what's the way he's been operating. And what's fascinating about this is that I think they met on the 13th, and the last solar eclipse that we just went through was at 20 degrees Cancer, and it was exactly opposite Pluto in the sky. and it was just 3 degrees off his Saturn. So it's off, it's the eclipse is on his Saturn, and it's potentially revealing the shadow of his lack of integrity. The Saturn being an integral part of who we are, and the part of truth and honesty, and where we all can agree what reality is. This part of him doesn't seem to be in integrity. And finally, it seems there's a break in that. Whereas up to this point, he seemed to have Teflon as a shield that just kind of deflected everything that was happening. And it's interesting, Michael Cohen, who his lawyer, okay, great. Michael Cohen was his personal lawyer for 10 years. And he says, now we don't know if this is true because he's a liar too, but he said that it was the meeting in Helsinki that Michael Cohen decided to turn on Trump and to Trump's calling it flipping, to basically say what actually happened and tell the truth. And this is a really fascinating event that, if you look at what happened for Michael Cohen in particular, two things. Like, he has a Saturn moon alignment, again, a noon chart. We don't know exactly where the moon is, but Saturn was at 10 or 9, 8 when he was arrested, and now it's back to 2, and it's square to his natal Saturn. So again, his level of integrity and how he's worked with that through his course of his career, Saturn career, and integrity and all that, it's not been within integrity, it's corrupt. And this is showing that it's a consequences of your actions, the karma coming back to find its truth. And what's really fascinating about this is he pleads guilty, and everyone's talking about on the news, I've heard it several times from different people, is that Michael Cohen feels free now. He feels like the burden of the weight of the Trump lies and corruption and everything is like off of his back. And look at where Uranus is. It's just 1 degree from trine to his sun, and it's stationing right there. And that really fit. I was like, wow, he's like the person who feels the freest now. And Trump seems to be holing up into a darker and darker hole, unfortunately. And this is the transits that Trump had for when Cohen pled guilty. Just to let you know, okay, yeah, so Cohen pled guilty to the payments, or several money laundering and bank fraud and stuff, but there's 2 counts of the payments to Karen McDougal and to Stormy Daniels. And those payments are potentially a violation of federal election law. But even if it's not an actual violation, it's clearly what the election laws were designed to prevent, which is, again, defrauding the United States people. Because if he's paying hush money to people who have dirt on him, and these payments happened in October 28th. This is like 10 days before the election, and so he's paying off these women to keep silent about the affairs that he had with them, and in essence defrauding the United States people of a fair election in doing so. And interestingly, Saturn in the sky is now just 6 degrees opposite his natal Mercury. It actually stationed at 8, so it was exactly opposite his natal Mercury. And Pluto in the sky is opposite his natal Saturn. And what's interesting about this, in correspondence to Richard Nixon and the Watergate crisis, is really similar transits. Nixon is born with the Mercury, Jupiter, Mars triple conjunction opposite Pluto, and so Nixon's Mercury is like Mars Mercury. It's he's got like the and vulgar, like all the obscenities is a Mercury Pluto. Like Pluto is the repressed and the taboo, And then Mercury has the taboo language. So like all the tapes, it's like, fuck, 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 he's like cussing all the time. And it's like, it's got this Mars like attacking energy as well. But what was fascinating about when in 1974 in March, 7 of Nixon's employees, people who worked in the White House, were indicted for the Watergate scandal. And look at where Saturn is. Sorry about that if that was me. Saturn conjoining Pluto, which is like the crisis, constitutional crisis, and opposite his natal Mercury. So Saturn coming, coming to account, public account for his lies. And like Nixon is like a Mercury Pluto liar. It was a power corrupt, like power, like dynamic where, not that Trump's isn't, but Trump's Mercury, it's a delusional lying. It's not like a calculated lying. It seems it's more of a lying that it's like spinning in circles and can't find like a core, which is the Neptunian, the Mercury-Neptune alignment that Trump has. But fascinatingly, Saturn is, the judge, the law, the government, authorities, the truth, bringing its weight, Saturn weight, down on Nixon's Mercury and Trump's Mercury. And this is interesting. This is Robert Mueller's chart. So what we're looking at is on the inside is Donald Trump's chart. And this is Robert Mueller's chart on the outside. And look at where Saturn is, right on Trump's Mercury. So Robert Mueller is assigned to bringing about the truth of what happened. And so Saturn in the sky is opposite Trump's Mercury, and Mueller's Saturn is right on his Mercury. And it seems as though the two of those things are most likely going to bring the truth out, is my guess. And I think what we're in for on some level is this Saturn-Pluto conjunction that's going to take place for the next 3 years, and it's going to become tighter and tighter into the opposition with his natal Saturn. I think it's exact at 22, and it's hard to see how Trump doesn't spend the rest of his life fighting court battles. Like, I don't know, it's hard to say, but it seems as though he's done so much at this point that he's already being sued by many people. And, I think, I don't know if he's going to be impeached. I mean, again, I don't do the prediction thing, but it's really hard for me to see how someone that has such little integrity, that lies compulsively, pathologically, could withstand a Saturn-Pluto conjunction opposite one's natal Saturn. And as the leader of the free world, it's like, I mean, if he was doing his own thing, whatever, but like, if you catapult yourself to the highest position in the world, lying, and then you have this transit, and then seeing what's happening, it's hard for me to see how this isn't just, it's just going to be more revealing and uglier for him, because he doesn't back down. He never apologizes. He never admits fault. So it seems as though it's only going to spiral downward, and he's going to continue to fight. And that's just an ugly, ugly, ugly situation. So I think it's just really sad, honestly, what all is happening. And I feel sorry for him, honestly. But back to where I started, it's like, he's showing us, he's an example of what, how to not embody these same alignments. And I kind of think, like, I'm not a Christian, but it's interesting in the Christian myth that Judas was, I think, one of his closest disciples, was betrayed him in the end. And that betrayal is what led to his, the crucifixion, which is what needed to happen in order for Christianity to happen. But yet Judas is seen as the evil, person who stabbed Jesus in the back. But on some level, Judas is like carrying this really important weight for Christianity to have happened by being the backstabber, in a sense, like, you know, being his evil side or whatever it is. I feel the same is true for Trump, actually, that like he's embodying this like really, really difficult task in showing us how not to be. And that's a judgment, I know, but like, it's just kind of the way I'm seeing it. It's hard for me to like get out of that perspective, but I'm open to seeing it different ways. It's just the way I've seen it. So I'm curious if you guys have any questions at all, or any comments, anything that you want to share, or thoughts on what I've shared or not. But those are a lot of the things that I wanted to say. We can obviously back up and talk about more aspects of all of this that's happened.
Okay, just give us a moment.
Sure.
There might be some questions coming. I mean, I have lots of questions, but I don't really want to make them public, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Yeah. So any comments from our audience? Yes, Chad.
I look forward to our private conversation.
Yes, exactly.
I have oh, go ahead.
I just appreciate, Chad, your explanation of coming transits, of the aspects and how they might play out. I agree with you that forecasting the future doesn't play out so well. I know some really, really good astrologers who could not believe who won the last election in the States. And I just find it interesting the way you presented astrological food for thought. And I want to thank you for that. I can't listen to too much on this issue these days, a bit overloaded, but you presented it in a very palatable and very informative way. So thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's a sticky situation, and I understand. I'm getting to that point too, where it's all too much. It's bewildering, and he's gaslighting us. He's lying to us in a way, trying to distort our own perception. I mean, he's even like in one of his rallies, he says, what you're seeing in the news, what you're reading is not what's happening. I mean, he just says it straight for word, like what you're seeing and it's not real. And he's trying to just straight up gaslight us, saying, I've got the truth. These people that are talking about me don't have the truth. And yeah, it is bewildering, and it's all too much. I agree with you. But if we don't stand up to him with compassion and love and a healthy mirror, then he's just going to continue to do what he's doing. And to me, it's really interesting that what I initially had as an experience in the first few weeks is like, wait, our president has way too much power. Like, even, we tried to get away from the kingship thing, but whoa, he still has a ton of power to just do so much. And, the Republican Congress and Senate are, they're complicit. It's interesting that what's happening here relative to Watergate, the Watergate break-in was like, it was the same thing. They're trying to break into the Democratic National Committee to try and get, stuff that they could utilize in the election against the Democrats. It's exactly the same crime, except the Russians did it, and they seem to have worked with them. And it actually seems like, from what Cohen says, is that Trump actually knew that the Russians had hacked the Democratic Commission, and so they knew that it was coming from Russia. So if that's the case, it is collusion or whatever. It's conspiracy to defraud the United States. And he may actually get impeached for it. We'll see. I think he should be. I think it would be better if we did that to show the world that we're not going to accept that a corrupt criminal as our president, and we're not going to paper over it until he gets out of office. Honestly, I think we would look better in the eyes of the world if we were to actually impeach him, which, hellish constitutional crisis thing to go through. But if he's a shadow representation of who we are, we need to be able to hold that mirror up so he can see it, and then we can see it, and we can all see the truth ultimately. That's what's really important. And yeah, so that's right. I'm gonna do something. Let's see if this works. Let me know if you guys are still seeing the screen.
Yeah, I'm seeing your desktop.
Okay, great. And then
animate, yep.
So
okay.
Let's see. So this is Trump's chart on the inside, and this is his transits today on the outside. And let's see if I can move this. And so yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see just what takes place over the next several months. Let's just look at the election. So, Saturn will continue to move into opposition with his Mercury, and it still will be just 3 degrees away on election day. Let's see, this is Sunday. It's probably, yeah. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. I'm not going to make any predictions, but yeah. Well, I'm glad this worked. Please.
I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
No, please.
I had wanted to know your thoughts on the Sagittarius Gemini axis, because especially since you brought up this chart, the rulers of both his nodes are going to be in basically a conjunction, even though it's going to be out of sign in this chart.
Oh, right.
Before you brought that up, I was going to ask about your thoughts on the the Sagittarius Gemini axis, because it seems like that's just, as far as this whole scenario, to me, it's so highlighted, because in evolutionary astrology we see Gemini and Sag as the truth versus lies axis. Oh. But I wanted to see what it was from your perspective.
Is there one side that has the truth versus one side that has the lies?
No, both can.
Okay.
Both can. Truth and lies.
Gotcha. Sag generally, Sag has the natural truth, the natural laws. And Gemini, I think Gemini would be more likely to have the lies myself. But anyway, okay.
Interesting.
But I see the Sag can be the lies as well, especially when you come into bring dogma into play, because basically that's what dogma is. You know, it's stretching, really stretching the truth and beliefs and things like that. So that's right. And I see both as truth and lies.
Yeah, fascinating.
And not just Gemini.
Fascinating. Yeah, he well, just as far as the Gemini Sag axis, I see as like, you know, the big picture versus the details, you know, the local environment, and personal expression versus, you know, more of a transpersonal embodiment. And like you're saying, Linda, the noble truths, it's like, you know, it does seem as though there's the impulse within Sagittarius towards the truth, towards the transcendent, in that sense, the truth. That's my judgment. But then, you know, the local truth, the environmental truth is a Gemini function. In Trump, actually, you know, he seems to be like, I mean, it's hard because I see Gemini as curious and, you know, mental, and he certainly is that. But he also is unpredictable and erratic, which is Uranus, but it feels like it has a Gemini quality to it. Maybe the constant dualism, like he says one thing, I see what you're saying, the lies. That is interesting. That maybe, I guess I'm kind of resonating with what Linda was saying, in that like maybe the dual aspect of Gemini has a tendency to be less truthful because there's two truths. I mean, I'm throwing this out there. You know what I'm saying, though? It's like there's two dynamics going on rather than a push for a single pull. It's just a thought.
Yeah, well, Gemini is actually speaking the truth or the lies. It's more the communicating. So that's really the only reason I saw it as that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
You know, that moon opposite the sun, I see also can be part of it, because it's in the gibbous phase. It's not in the full phase just yet, and he has a tendency to retreat back to narcissism rather than seeing the other or cooperating with the social sphere.
Right.
What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been noticing that a little bit more recently, actually, with personal people who I know that have personal signs versus transpersonal signs, and they do seem more oriented around oneself. I mean, it seems pretty clear that there's less of that other, you know, in the sense of a recognition of the whole. There's more of just a need to express and identify and know oneself more so than orienting towards the whole. And I don't think there's any, you know, hard truth about that, but I am resonating with that principle in general lately, just in the people that I've been hanging out with. But
you know, and then Uranus rebelling and perhaps, you know, telling lies on purpose, perhaps like the trickster.
Right, he's definitely a trickster for sure. Yeah. I've often associated narcissism with Neptune, and the Mercury-Neptune aspect seems to be strong in his own. I mean, it's clear his rhetoric and his inability to stick to the truth, but the kind of vanity and the constantly idolizing one's own being, part of that is the Neptune, it seems. And then I think a good part of it is the Jupiter trine sun as well, just the arrogance and inflation of self and the sense of superiority that feeds into that. So I think it feels like a combination.
Yeah, like with Pluto and Capricorn now, and, you know, for several more years, the big focus has been on race. and racism. And, you know, if that is our shadow, there's also freedom from that shadow as well. There's the positive expression, right? So
Absolutely.
what is the positive expression? I mean, I don't feel like, I don't know, I don't really want to talk about myself too much, but I feel that oneness very strongly because I've got Neptune on the ascendant. Yeah. So what is a signature for the worst type or the best type?
Of the Saturn Pluto?
No, of racism.
Wait, I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, so coming from that racist shadow, what would be a signature for that in the chart? Are you saying Pluto, Saturn?
Yeah, the Saturn Pluto tends to be the part of our identity that splits off and sees ourselves as separate and tends to other in the sense of seeing other people as less valuable than oneself.
Isn't that a conditioning pattern of over thousands of years?
Absolutely, and like that very much so. And it my bigger work that I'm focusing on is through quantum mechanics, in the sense that it reveals the nature of reality as that we're not separate. Quantum mechanics, and it's not just quantum mechanics. I mean, it's that word, it trips people up. It might as well be called our best science. I mean, it is the most highly accurate science, just hands down. And it says that we're not separate from the universe. We're literally not separate. The act of observing something is a co-creative act. We're not separate. We're literally, the reality we see is a co-created reality. It doesn't exist as we see it in and of itself. It exists as we see it because we see it that way. That's what our best science tells us, that we're not separate. So like, yeah, everybody feels themselves as separate, and as an individual, and we are, to a very clear perspective, in that we are born and we die, and that is our life, and it is separate in that individual sense. It's our own. But we only emerge out of the interaction of two people, and we only know ourselves in relationship. Like you cannot take yourself out of the world and know yourself. You are a product of every experience you've ever had. So like we are relating, we're relational beings, like, period. We don't exist outside of relationship. We only really know ourselves through relationship. But then the critical factor, it seems, for our evolution to continue is to develop a higher level of self-reflectivity, so that we can recognize that we're not separate. Because right now we see ourselves as separate, forged in a subject-object relationship to each other and to the world. And it's ultimately not true. It's not real. We're not separate. And that's what I'm saying. Like quantum mechanics and the archetypal astrological perspective says that we're not separate. It says we're not, mechanics says we're not separate on the immediate level and the way we interact with the world. And astrology says we're not separate from the cosmos at large. You're connected, deeply connected to the whole of the cosmos. And your chart reflects the depth of your psyche. The depth of the human psyche is embodied in the movements of the planets. We're not separate from them. So they're interwoven. Yeah, please.
Sorry.
No.
Are you saying that, let's talk about Trump, the way he perceives his existence is actually creating his existence. So therefore, is he totally self-deluded? But does he also have power? Like somebody in the chat said, does he have occult power? What do you think?
Occult power?
Yes, as in negative energy.
I mean, I think he's being possessed by the darker forces of the archetypes, in the sense, or the more problematic sides of them. I don't actually, like, I don't like to pin down anyone. I feel like everyone has the capacity for change, even Trump. Like, and so I feel as though he's embodying the less life-enhancing potentials of this chart, and in large part because he does see himself as separate from everything. And that's on some level, you think about it, it's the only way you can attack everything.
But then on the other hand, being the most powerful man in the world, wouldn't he see himself as godlike?
Yeah, I mean, today,
and people attributing that to him as well?
Yeah, we're moving in that direction. I mean, I think it's going to end worse and not that way. But this morning on a Fox and Friends interview, he said that he said that if he were to get impeached, that everyone would be poor. He said the economy would go down. He said everyone would be poor. But like the level of like narcissism and superiority and godlike power, that like if he's gone, everything goes to shit. That's that inflation, narcissistic inflation that he sees in himself as so, you know, the ubermensch of importance in the world.
Yeah, and also with Pluto and Capricorn, you know, merging with power, osmosing power. So therefore, what I've always felt is, and I'm not from USA, I've always felt that people were wanting to merge with him and osmose his power because they wanted to be like him and wanted to be, you know, wanted to become rich. Sure. And saw him as the answer to that. You know, yeah. It's basically like a survival instinct.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And that's also why the people who voted for him. It's like the strongman mentality, you know, that like, he's a protector, he's going to save us, you know. And unfortunately, the opposite, it seems, is true, that he's about saving himself. He's not really about others. He's about himself, it seems. And the power aspect, it is really interesting that Pluto is not only opposite as Saturn, but it's square to his natal Jupiter. And you see that often with power and people who ascend to power and corrupt by it, get, you know, possessed by it. It's interesting. Vladimir Putin has Jupiter Pluto in his natal chart, and it was just being aspected by Jupiter and Pluto throughout this period where he's become way more powerful than he was before. It seems. I mean, he's had a lot of good fortune, it seems. I mean, who knows what it's going to actually lead to, but right now, I mean, it's considered the most successful espionage operation in history, the attack on the United States election in 2016. So, you know, we'll see. I mean, but the power thing, yeah, I feel like, you know, his narcissism and stuff, it also allows people to identify with that narcissism in themselves and with him, and that they're somehow uplifted by his uplifting himself. I really feel like we're evolving past this. I hope, my deep hope, and it was a belief before he was elected, is that we're transcending that level of narcissism and hubris and self-importance and egotism. Like, I just feel as though that's the direction humanity is heading in. And on some level, this is like, hopefully a last gasp of the modern Western ego that sees itself as superior. It's the white European male ego that has been running the world for the last 400 years because of modern science that developed in Europe in white consciousness. And it's that you know, confidence of knowing reality that science has appropriated. It's allowed us to, you know, cell phones, everything, it's satellites, all this stuff, to see the universe in detail is an extremely compelling, extremely powerful identification with the human mind, that it can see reality as it is. Thankfully, thank God, it's not the case. quantum mechanics says it's not true. You don't actually see the reality as it is. You see it as a co-constructed process, the product of your interaction with it. It actually doesn't exist in and of itself in any way that we can be sure of. And that is a blessing, because what that does is it allows for free will and for novelty in the universe to exist. It allows for the universe to be creative and novel in its evolution rather than determined. If modern science, as it evolved in the past 300 or 400 years before quantum mechanics, had continued as it was going, the idea was that you would predict everything, even human psychology, that everything in the universe would be a determined and a predetermined in a way that which you can predict everything that would unfold from here on out. And that, thank God, is not the case, because we would live in a universe that had no freedom. It would have no room for our will from the universe. Did you have a question?
Wow, I love it. Any further questions from our audience or comments? So, Chad, any final statements, comments that you'd like to make? Oops.
Okay. I do. I mean, I just want to say that I have a deep love for humanity. I think that this is it's a noble project that we're involved in, and I think that I was just saying that quantum mechanics and astrology say that we're meant to be here. I mean, astrology says we're meant to be here. That there's a intelligence in the universe that loves us so much, it wants us to be able to know ourselves, to be able to see who we are in relationship to the entire cosmos, to see how we are embedded in it, and participants, co-creative actors. That's what the astrological perspective seems to be indicating to me as one of its primary functions. And that, it's the most uplifting truth about the nature of reality that I'm aware of, and it's deeply inspiring, and it gives me a lot of hope for humanity, because it seems as though the intelligence wants us to be here, and it wants us to make this shift to a new understanding of ourselves and how we relate to the whole. So.
Yeah, we can really feel it, like it's just there,
just around the corner, hopefully. Right?
Yeah, exactly. You could just almost reach out and grab it. Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, look, I've been so fascinated by your thoughts on all of these fascinating topics. So thank you so much from me, and thank you so much from all of us. Looking forward to seeing you next time.
Me too.
Yeah, so would you all please thank Chad Alexander Harris, everyone?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chad.
Thank you, Chad. Really interesting.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it as well, and I'm looking forward to the next opportunity.